thanks for getting together to do this and to talk about what you do and who you are. And I want to start with that question. If I were to ask you who you are, what would you say?
The most direct answer would be awareness experienced.
Mm-hmm. As a teacher, who would you say you are?
A teacher?
Yeah. Do you consider yourself a teacher?
I consider that one of my primary roles.
Mm-hmm.
That's the function of the work I do is teacher. I don't consider it an identity as what I am. It's just something that I do.
Mm.
It's an activity.
Mm-hmm. How did you get involved in a spiritual quest in the first place, and how did it lead to becoming a teacher?
That's a big question. Well, I think I got interested in spirituality, at least in the form that I started to practice in Zen when I was about 20 years old or so. I started reading some books. I don't really remember what the first book I read was.
Mm-hmm.
I remember some of the books by Alan Watts were in there in the beginning, and
mm-hmm. Like the book. Do you remember the one?
The book, yeah.
On the taboo against knowing who you are.
And the way of Zen, or something similar to that.
Mm-hmm.
So a number of these kind of things that I just started to explore. I think I was really looking to I actually sat down one day to meditate, and it only took that one time of just sitting down to meditate, and I got hooked on something about the quietness. Really sort of captured my imagination.
Mm-hmm.
It was almost like there was this whole world that opened up the first time I ever meditated. Not that amazing things were happening, but I could just sense there was this whole other world that was available. And
mm-hmm.
then I went out to learn more about it, I guess you might say.
Mm-hmm. So that hooked you.
That was the hook.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah. That was the beginning of it. That was
mm-hmm.
the interest part of wow, there's this whole different world going on. I think I had definitely been exposed to that world since I was very, very young. I'd had what a lot of people would call spiritual or mystical experiences from the time I can remember.
Mm-hmm.
Although I didn't think of them that way. I think children don't think of them as spiritual or mystical or unusual. They were just sort of things that would occasionally happen.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think when I meditated, it was almost like a time of remembering
that you had those experiences.
That I'd had them.
Uh-huh.
And I had them actually all the way, in some sense or another, almost all the way up to that time that I started to just meditate. I had actually been having certain experiences periodically.
Mm-hmm.
I used to call them, as I got older into junior high school and high school, I used to call them one of those days.
Mm-hmm.
And it was mm-hmm. one of those days where
mm-hmm.
I would wake up and everything would just be different. I would walk around kind of really not knowing who I am, or almost like the identity had dropped away.
Mm-hmm.
And I just felt like, almost like emptiness looking through my own eyeballs and feeling this incredible intimacy or oneness with everything around me.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't even think of it as spiritual or mystical or anything like that. I
mm-hmm.
literally just would say to myself, oh, here's one of those days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you had a great childhood, it sounds like.
I did have a great childhood,
yeah.
actually.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
I remember as a kid having occasional experiences like that, but it was mostly when I was swinging upside down on a swing or something. Like the whole world would look fascinating, and I think that's a pretty universal experience.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
You go out in the middle of the street where you live and you look through your legs upside down up the street, like everything is everything is different.
Right.
And the world takes on a sort of a mystery. But it sounds as though from an early age your experiences were, well, in retrospect, would you say now that you were having a kind of awakening experience as a child?
Looking back, I think there was, I actually was.
Mm.
I mean, if I had the cognitive ability and the interest, which I really didn't have at that time, if somebody had just sort of said, that's it, kid.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if I had been on like the quest for enlightenment and someone had said, that's it,
mm-hmm.
then I think in a really profound way that that would have been it. That would have been any kind of seeking sort of would have been pretty much over with.
Mm-hmm.
But I just was very innocent about the whole thing. Very innocent, very naive, and all I would do on those days is just, I started to realize I had to be a little bit careful of how I looked at people, because the tendency was to stare at them very sort of profoundly and very deeply, almost like I could see the mystery that I was experiencing reflected in them. And so there was this tendency to sort of just stare at them and like, what's really going on?
Mm-hmm.
So it was very interesting.
Mm.
And that was kind of, I think that kind of got stimulated in a whole new way when I started to meditate.
Because you were reminded of it? Or did it qualitatively start to shift too?
I didn't necessarily remember those events when I started to meditate. I didn't actually remember those events for quite a few years.
Mm.
Even though they had happened, these sort of things that I'm calling one of those days had happened right up till the time I was about 18 or 19. And at 20, here I started sort of the spiritual quest, and somehow I kind of forgot about them for several years. Especially once the spiritual quest began. Once I decided I really wanted to be enlightened, well then those experiences became much more difficult to find.
Maybe we should define some terms. I'd like to ask you, since you're using the word enlightenment, how you define it and what it means to you experientially.
Well, to me, enlightenment in the most simple sense means knowing what you are.
And what are you?
Well, like I said,
we're back to the first question.
Right. Awareness experienced. So, I mean, it's really, I can give you very quick, very easy sort of answers, but they're all conceptual. The reason I say awareness experienced is awareness really is a word that I would be using for something that might be called spirit, nothingness. It's an awake nothingness.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that sense, I call it awareness, an awake nothingness. But it's not just an awake nothingness, it's the awake nothingness experiencing itself through human form, through human bodies and through minds, and all of our experience is actually that unmanifest potential, which is the awakeness which is within everything and everybody, and it's experiencing itself. Without these human minds and bodies, then there would be a knowing. This awake emptiness or eternity would know itself, but it wouldn't really be able to experience itself. So that's why I like to say awareness experienced.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that definition of enlightenment is different from what's in the popular vernacular when people use that word?
Oh, sure.
In spiritual circles?
Yeah. Yes.
And how is it different?
Well, I mean, the popular vernacular kind of really tends to be on what spiritual path or group you tend to find yourself in.
Mm-hmm.
I think the difference, in one sense, is that so often the enlightenment is talked about as some sort of sustained, transcendent experience.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there is no such thing as a sustained, transcendent experience, because every experience by its nature has a limited lifespan. It kind of comes and it goes.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, it's really sort of the ultimate non-experience experience. It's really knowing, awakening, and realizing what you are. That's the first phase, you might say, of really knowing what you are. And the second phase is then actualizing what you are. So as a human being, the ability to express that mystery of your own self, so that eternity is actually functioning and expressing itself in a much more clear or conscious way through your human personality, through your humanness.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that's the most simple way of putting it.
Mm-hmm. And so those who believe that enlightenment is some sustained experience of nirvana, would you say that is a philosophy that tends to focus more on escapism, or